As a, I was supposed to kick this off with Director Mulvaney. He's still on a call with the governors. We continue to host a ton of briefings today with key stakeholders, and so my goal, if this times out right, is that as we finish up, Director Mulvaney will walk in the room right on cue, and then he will talk to you a little bit about the budget, and we will walk through Q&A on that. So hopefully this all works. I'm going to skip past the part where I say thank you, Director Mulvaney. As the director will say, the president's budget blueprint keeps his promise to put America's security first, turning his words directly into policies that restore and respect for our citizens' hard-earned tax dollars. There were some additional non-budget events of the day. This morning, the president had a bilateral meeting with the Taoiseach Kenny of Ireland. Our two nations have a long history, common values, and important economic ties. The president was honored to host him here in the Oval Office and recommit to strong social, political, and economic relations between the U.S. and Ireland. This afternoon, the president made the remarks at the Friends of Ireland luncheon at the Capitol. This traditional lunch celebrating Americans' bipartisan commitment to peace and security in Ireland was started in 1983 by President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill, both proud Irish Americans, and has been attended by every president, speaker, and Taoiseach of Ireland since then. And also while at the Capitol this afternoon, right around now, the Vice President is swearing in former Senator Dan Coats as the next Director of National Intelligence in his ceremonial office. Former Senator Coats has clearly demonstrated the subject matter expertise and sound judgment required to lead our intelligence community, and the President is finally glad to have him on board as part of his team. Later this evening, the President, along with Taoiseach Kenny, will attend the St. Patrick's Day reception and participate in the annual Shamrock ceremony. Since 1952, the President has invited the Taoiseach to come to the White House in celebration of St. Patrick's Day, where they present a bowl of shamrocks as a symbol of the profound and lasting relationship between the two countries. The President and Taoiseach Kenny will also make remarks. I have a few more notes before I get to Director Mulvaney. First, I wanted to share with you guys, it's a letter that should be going out shortly, if it hasn't already, that the President signed this morning wishing Ray Chavez, the oldest living survivor of Pearl Harbor, a happy 105th birthday. Our nation owes Mr. Chavez's generation and he a great generation, a debt of gratitude for extraordinary legacy of liberty, freedom around the world, fighting to ensure security and prosperity for millions. A copy of the letter will be sent out if it hasn't already, and obviously we all extend our warm wishes to Ray and his family as they celebrate his 105th, and the President signed the letter wishing that he hopes to have several more birthdays to come. This afternoon, the President announced his intent to nominate several individuals to key posts at the Department of Defense. Robert Daigle as the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, Elaine McCluster as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, David Norquist as Undersecretary of Defense and Comptroller, Kenneth Rapano as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Security and Homeland Defense and Global Security, Patrick Shanahan as Deputy Secretary of Defense, and David Joel Trachtenberg as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The President's glad to have these extremely qualified men and women on board to assist Secretary Mattis as he undertakes the great rebuilding of our nation's military. Also this afternoon, the President declared a major disaster in the state of California and ordered federal assistance to supplement state, tribal, and local recovery efforts in the areas affected by severe winter storms, flooding, and mudslides this January. We also announced this afternoon that Second Lady Karen Pence will lead the presidential delegation to the 2017 Special Olympics World Winter Games in Austria. The House Budget Committee met earlier this morning and approved the American Health Care Act, making it now the third committee to move the AHCA forward. We're working hand in glove with the House to consider improvements, and we're confident that this thoughtful and thorough process will lead to legislation that reforms our health care, making it more affordable and accessible to every American. Since we won't have a chance to meet tomorrow in light of the President and Chancellor Merkel's press conference, I want to quickly walk you through a couple of events on the President's schedule. Tomorrow, of course, the President will welcome German Chancellor Merkel here to the White House rescheduling from the snow inclement weather that prevented that from happening the other day. The President and the Chancellor have a series of meetings, and then we'll host a roundtable focusing on the importance of vocational training with both American and German business leaders. They will also have a press conference in the afternoon. We'll have details on the entire day later this afternoon. Also tomorrow, the President will attend a listening session with Veterans Affairs and VA Secretary Shulkin and representative from the various Veteran Services organizations. It's incredibly important to the President that we reform the VA system so they can fulfill the promises made to the men and women who risk their lives for our nation. He looks forward to discussing potential changes that can help improve the Veterans Administration. On Monday, the President will meet with Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft. He'll also have lunch with the Vice President and a meeting with the Secretary of State. Later that afternoon, the President will welcome Prime Minister Abadi of Iraq to the White House. And on Wednesday, the President has invited all 49 members of the Congressional Black Caucus to come to the White House for a meeting. The President looks forward to welcoming for what he hopes will be a productive discussion. And I also want to remind everyone that I did yesterday via Twitter that the lottery for the 139th annual White House Easter egg roll is open until Saturday, this coming Saturday. Everyone who's interested in attending can go to recreation.gov. Further information is at whitehouse.gov for details. At his rally last night, the President addressed the decision by the federal district court in Hawaii to block his lawfully executive order. As the President said last night, quote, "The law and the Constitution give the President the power to suspend immigration when he deems it to be necessary in the national interest." The court didn't even bother to quote the relevant statute in its opinion, which could have plainly shown that the President clearly has this authority. I know you've heard it before, but since the court didn't, let me quote it again for you. 8 U.S. Code 1182 states, quote, "Whenever the President finds the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may, by proclamation, and for such period as he deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem appropriate," end quote. The Department of Justice, quote, said in a statement that they strongly disagree with the federal district court's ruling, which is flawed in both reasoning and scope. DOJ continued, quote, "The President's executive order falls squarely within his lawful authority in seeking to protect our nation's security, and the Department will continue to defend his executive order in the courts. The Department is exploring all available options to vigorously defend this executive order. We intend to appeal the flawed rulings. Currently, the Department of Justice is determining the legal strategy and timing. We expect action to be taken soon to appeal the ruling in the Fourth Circuit and to seek clarification of the order prior to appeal in the Ninth Circuit. The danger is real and the law is clear. The President was elected to change our broken immigration system, and he will continue to exercise his constitutional authority and presidential responsibility to protect our nation." And just before I get to your questions, and then before I will introduce Director Mulvaney, I just want to follow up on a couple questions that have come up recently. John Decker asked multiple times on the enforcement of the President's executive order to restrict lobbying activities of executive branch employees, which includes a 5-year ban on lobbying agencies where you've served and a lifetime ban on lobbying from foreign governments. I said I'd get back to John, so here we go. The executive order itself has a section 5, which focuses on enforcement. The order outlines that each agency head is tasked with working with the Office of Government Ethics to establish procedures for determining potential violations of the ethics pledge. Should a violation be determined, the executive order authorizes the Department of Justice to enforce the order through several mechanisms. Debarment proceedings, these would restrict an individual or his or her associated entities from doing business with the federal government. Seeking an injunction, such as a restraining order from lobbying for 10 years, the 5 years in the ethics agreement plus an additional 5 years, or civil penalties such as a fine commensurate with the nature of the violation. The President fully expects the Department of Justice to vigorously enforce this executive order. Also, yesterday, several of you asked where the House is in regard to additional legislation as outlined in the third prong of the AHCA, and the President's plan to reform health care. I'm pleased to note that last night, Leader McCarthy in the House introduced 4 pieces of legislation that will remove burdensome regulations, lower costs, and increase access, as we've noted. The Competitive Health Insurance Reform Act, H.R. 372, which eliminates antitrust protection for insurance provider, creating competition so that Americans are not left with just one choice for health care coverage. The Small Business Health Fairness Act, H.R. 1101, which allows small businesses to band together and negotiate lower prices. The Protecting Access to Care Act, H.R. 1215, which limits frivolous lawsuits that unnecessarily drive up health care costs. And the Self-Insurance Protection Act, H.R. 1304, which protects workers who get their health care coverage from employers that self-insure by providing a backstop on catastrophic losses. And finally, in terms of following up from yesterday, in regard to the DOJ's indictments of Russian hackers on Yahoo data, this action demonstrates the United States' commitment to identifying cyber criminals and bringing them to justice no matter where they are. It also highlights the criminal importance of international cooperation to our cyber regime. And like I said yesterday, as though this is a lawful enforcement action, anything beyond that, I would direct you to the Department of Justice and the FBI for further details. Before I continue, let me turn it over to Director Mulvaney to talk a little bit about the budget. Director.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon and happy day before St. Patrick's Day, also known as Budget Day. Most of you heard me talk about the budget before, so I'm not going to say too many things in opening before we get to your questions. But we will remind you that this is what we're calling the America First budget. We had an America First candidate. You now have an America First president, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that we have an America First budget. You've seen the details. As we talked about last week, $54 billion of additional defense spending. We have some more details today on where that money is going. We're seeing increases at the VA, increases within the Department of Justice for law enforcement, increases within the Department of Homeland Security for things that include border security and immigration controls. Increases within the Department of Energy to deal with a nuclear triad, and then corresponding reductions in similar amounts, offsetting dollar for dollar in other programs. The largest reduction, if you've seen the budget already, is a 31% reduction within the Environmental Protection Agency. The next largest reduction on a percentage basis is within Department of State, and the other departments are reduced in lesser amounts. I think the smallest reduction we have is NASA, which is just less than 1%. But there again, as with many of the agencies, you'll see certain line items within those budgets plussed up. This is the message the President wanted to send to the public, to the press, to Capitol Hill. He wants more money for defense, more money for border enforcement, more money for law enforcement generally, more money for the vets, more money for school choice, and then to offset that money with savings elsewhere so that all of that is done without an additional dollar added to the deficit. As I've mentioned before, this budget does not balance the budget. This budget simply reallocates and reprioritizes spending as any family or business would do. This budget does not, for those of you who were not here last week, this budget does not address the big picture items such as policy changes, revenue flows, tax policy, mandatory spending. This is simply the top line spending budget. It's why we call it the budget blueprint and not the full budget. That full budget, which will contain all the rest of those pieces and parts, will be released in May. Before I take questions, I'm going to do something I don't ordinarily do, and I'm sure it's kind of new. I'm going to call on the New York Times because they're in trouble. Apparently, is there where's my New York Times guy? Matt Flagenheimer and Alan Rappaport, okay, are in big trouble. I'll give you the first question, but you have to deliver this message to them. They printed this morning that I'm the father of 17-year-old triplet girls. My 17-year-old daughter really wishes that were happy, or really wishes that had happened, but my two 17-year-old sons are really upset. So if you could clarify that, that would be great, and I'll give you the first question if you've got one. So go ahead.
Okay, well, we're not very good at math, obviously, at the New York Times.
Math is right. It's actually the gender that was wrong.
But, sir, during the campaign, President Trump, then candidate Trump, talked about the national debt, which, of course, has reached around $20 trillion. You mentioned it in your budget message this morning. Is there a plan, as the president talked about during last year's campaign, to actually eliminate the national debt in 8 years? He said during the campaign it would be easy to actually eliminate the entire debt, not the deficit, but the debt in 8 years. Is that something that this president is actually committed to trying to do?
It's a good question. It's a fair question. I would just suggest to you it's not the right time for the question. The budget blueprint, again, does not deal with the debt. It even doesn't even deal with the deficit. It is simply the first part of the appropriations process. We'll send this up to the Hill now, and the appropriations committees of the House and the Senate. Of course, the House controls the power of the purse. Congress controls the power of the purse. And this will be the first step in that process. We will start to address the issues of the longer-term deficit, longer-term debt in that larger budget. And of course, we'll have to deal at that time with things like mandatory spending, tax policy, revenue flows to the government. So again, it's a fair question. I just don't think now is the time to ask the question. John?
Question, the 28% that comes out of the State Department, I know that you're leaving a lot of discretion to the people who are in charge there at all of these agencies for how to implement these cuts, but how much is intended to come out of the foreign aid budget of that $10 billion?
A lot of it. Keep in mind, as I've said before, one of the reasons that you've seen such a dramatic reduction in the State Department on a percentage basis is not that this president thinks that diplomacy is not important. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. We've already seen that Secretary Tillerson has had a tremendous one diplomatic success already on the deal he cut with Iraq. The president believes in diplomacy, and we believe that this budget protects that core function of the State Department. It just so happens that much of the foreign aid that the president talked about in campaign, much of the money that goes to climate research, green energy, those types of things, are actually in the State Department budget. If those line items had been in the Department of Commerce, you would see Department of Commerce having gone down by by a similarly large percentage. So the answer to your question is that most of the cuts within the State Department try to focus directly on foreign aid. Yes, sir.
Yes, the budget showed a 0.8% decrease for NASA, but you've also talked about in the administration using private companies such as SpaceX, for example, for more of that. So does this show is some of this going to be shifted over to the private sector, and does this show a commitment on the administration's part towards science and NASA?
It does. Again, if you go back and you do what we did, which is go back through the president's speeches, the interviews he gave, and just talking to him, we tried to identify his priorities. And one of the things he told us was, look, I'm still interested in America being involved in space exploration. So even though the overall top-line number at NASA is reduced by a small fraction, I think it's 0.8%, as you mentioned, individual line items that deal with specifically space exploration are actually plussed up. And part of the intent there is to promote exactly what you just talked about. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Your own experience in the House tells you that a lot of these cuts haven't been voted for before. Do you consider this budget an opening bid, and do you expect a lot of pushback even from Republicans on the specificity and the size of these cuts? And secondly, to take your point about the president's words on the campaign, those of us who traveled around with him remember he said he didn't want to touch Social Security, Medicare, the big entitlements. The fact that that's not in this budget, is that a signal that those programs are going to remain untouched, and as the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget said, that ignores 70% of spending and 90% of its growth over the next decade?
I'll deal with the second one first, which the president is absolutely going to keep the promises he kept on the campaign trail. Again, you will see no reference in Social Security here, no reference to Medicare here, no reference to Medicaid here or any of the other mandatory programs, what some people call entitlement programs, because that's not what this budget is. This is the discretionary part of the budget, half of which, as you know, is defense, and the other half is everything else, the alphabet soup of government. So just because it's not here doesn't mean we're dodging the issue. You would never see in any budget blueprint that deals with the top-line spending numbers, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. To your other question about it not being popular on the Hill, yeah, I can recognize that. I've been on the Hill enough to know that some of these will be very unpopular. Keep in mind, the president is in a unique position. I've been a member of Congress. I represented 700,000 people in South Carolina. I had my constituency. It was a district. Senators represent an entire state. We're always dealing with special interests from back home. We're dealing with lobbyists from back home. The president is beholden to none of that. The president is drafted a budget for the entire nation because that's who he sees himself as representing. He did not ask lobbyists for input on this. He did not ask special interests for input on this, and he certainly didn't focus on how these programs might impact a specific congressional district. But we know that going into it. And again, the message we're sending to the Hill is we want more money for the things the president talked about, defense being the top one, national security, and we don't want to add to the budget deficit. If Congress has another way to do that, we're happy to talk about it. Yes, sir, in the glasses.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. The United Nations says the world's currently facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the end of World War II. 20 million people in just 4 countries facing starvation or famine, and yet you're cutting funding to the UN, funding to the foreign aid budget. Are you worried that some of the most vulnerable people on Earth will suffer as a result.
Now, we're absolutely reducing funding to the UN and to the various foreign aid programs, including those run by the UN and other agencies. That should come as a surprise to no one who watched the campaign. The president said specifically, hundreds of times, you covered him, I'm going to spend less money on people overseas and more money on people back home. And that's exactly what we're doing with this budget. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Given your focus on dollar for dollar offsets in fiscal 18, for your fiscal year 2017 request, you didn't insist on dollar for dollar offsets. Why is that? Why are you not concerned about adding to the deficit in fiscal 2017?
The large part of the question deals with the 2017 request, which is a $30 billion. I think it's actually $3 billion and a half in there for the wall, and it's not entirely offset. There's a couple reasons for that. One of them is time. Another one is that some of that is what they call overseas contingency operations. Now, you also know that I have a somewhat colored history with the overseas contingency operation, but I will tell you that we went through this and made sure that the money that's being requested is true OCO. Means that it's focused truly on the areas where we involved overseas, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, those types of places. So we have sent them $18 billion worth of proposed reductions for the 2017, but not all of them were offset. Yes, ma'am.
Melanie Order, CNSNews.com. The president has called for eliminating funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Endowment for the Arts. Yet the Republican Congress sends the president appropriations bills that fund CPB and NEA. Will he veto those bills and tell the Republican leadership to send bills that defund those things?
I think the message the president sent right now is that we want to defund those, and there's completely defensible reasons for doing that. It's a simple message, by the way. I put myself in the shoes of that steel worker in Ohio, the coal mining family in West Virginia, the mother of two in Detroit, and I'm saying, okay, I have to go ask these folks for money, and I have to tell them where I'm going to spend it. Can I really go to those folks, look them in the eye, and say, look, I want to take money from you, and I want to give it to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? That is a really hard sell. In fact, something we don't think we can defend anymore. As to specific vetoes, you and I both know it doesn't come over one by one. Line item by line item doesn't come over. They come over in large appropriations bills. And we'll work with Congress to go through the appropriations process, and we will make determinations on whether or not to sign appropriations bills or veto them at the appropriate time. Yes, sir.
There's several places in the budget where you're talking about eliminating funding for unauthorized programs.
Yeah.
Are you laying down a marker about unauthorized programs, and do you think spending discipline would be improved if Congress authorized everything that it was?
We hope so. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, we actually spend a lot of money in the federal government that's on programs that aren't authorized at all. Remember, the spending is sort of, to break it down, it's sort of a three-step process to spend money. You have to budget for it first. Then you have to authorize it, and then you have to appropriate it. But a lot of the programs that we've spent money on for years have been unauthorized spending. Either they used to be authorized, actually most of them used to be authorized and then they simply lapsed, and some of them were just never authorized in the first place. They simply were appropriated without any authorization. And yeah, the message is that's not the right way to do it. In fact, we think that's the wrong way to do it. You heard the president talk specifically on the campaign trail about at least 5% reductions for unauthorized programs, and that's what generated this budget. Yes, sir.
Director Mulvaney, you talk about this budget basically keeping the promises that the president made during the course of the campaign. The housing and urban development, from housing and urban development, this budget blueprint calls for a 13% reduction, $6 billion. During the course of the campaign, President Trump said, specifically to urban black voters, he says, what do you have to lose? It turns out what they have to lose is at least $6 billion that goes to many programs that benefit those communities. What do you say to those Americans who feel that promise?
Nobody's going to get kicked out of their houses. What we did when we looked at the HUD budget was try to figure out a way to spend money better. And what we saw, and I talked to Dr. Carson about this just today, what we saw as we went through the analysis of the HUD budget is that a lot of their money got spent on government housing and building it. It's actually infrastructure. Okay? And what Secretary Carson and I talked about is figuring out a way to do that better. And as we did that, what we realized was we are working on a large infrastructure program that we hope to roll out this summer. And what Secretary Carson wants to do is take the money for the infrastructure that's in HUD right now and not very well run and move that into this larger program. In fact, you'll see the same line items or similar line items in the Department of Transportation for the same reason. These do not mean the president is changing his commitment to infrastructure. Again, far from it. What we're saying is, look, for years and years we have built infrastructure like this, and it doesn't work very well. So let me finish and I'll come back to you. And then, so what we're doing now is we're taking it out of the discretionary budget and we're going to move it into the larger infrastructure plan this summer.
But you know,
Yes.
well, housing and urban development and the community development block grants aren't exclusively about housing. They support a variety of different programs, including in part Meals on Wheels that affects a lot of Americans. In Austin, Texas today, one organization there that delivers those meals to thousands of elderly says that those citizens will no longer be able to be provided those meals in those communities. So what do you say to those Americans who are ultimately losing out, not on housing, but on other things that are taken out of
Right,
this budget?
and as you know, or I think you know, that Meals on Wheels is not a federal program. It's part of that community, that CDBGs, the block grants that we give to the states. And and many states make the decision to use that money on Meals on Wheels. Here's what I can tell you about CDBGs, because that's what we fund, right? Is that we spent $150 billion on those programs since the 1970s. The CDBGs have been identified as programs since, I believe, the second Bush administration, as ones that were just not showing any results. That we can't do that anymore. We can't spend money on programs just because they sound good and great. Meals on Wheels sounds great. Again, that's a state decision to fund that particular portion of it, to take the federal money and give it to the states and say, look, we want to give you money for programs that don't work. I can't defend that anymore. We cannot defend that anymore. We're $20 trillion in debt. We're going to spend money. We're going to spend a lot of money, but we're not going to spend it on programs that cannot show that they actually deliver the promises that we've made to
So you
people.
talk about programs that do work or don't work. There's a program called The Shine that's in Pennsylvania, rural counties of Pennsylvania, that provides after-school educational programs for individuals in those areas, which just so happens to be the state that helped propel President Trump to the White House. I'm curious what you say to those Americans in a community where they tell me today that 800 individuals will no longer, children who need it most, will no longer be provided in those most needy of communities the educational care they need.
I'm not familiar. Y'all are at an advantage over me because I have to memorize all 4,000 line
programs will
items.
be
So
fine.
let's talk about after-school programs generally. They're supposed to be educational programs, right? And that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to help kids who don't get fed at home get fed so they do better in school. Guess what? There's no demonstrable evidence they're actually doing that. There's no demonstrable evidence they're actually helping results, helping kids do better in school, which is what, when we took your money from you to say, look, we're going to go spend on an after-school program, the way we justified it was, these programs are going to help these kids do better in school and get better jobs. And we can't prove that that's happening.
To be clear, we're saying, the administration with this budget is saying that no after-school programs out there are doing their job in helping educate these
No,
children.
but I
as
don't,
they-
and again, now you're asking me a question I don't know the answer to, but I don't believe we cut all the funding for those types of things. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mulvaney, just to follow up on that, you were talking about the steel worker in Ohio and the coal miner in Pennsylvania and so on, but those workers may have an elderly mother who depends on the Meals on Wheels program, who may have kids in Head Start. And yesterday or the day before, you described this as a hard power budget, but is it also a hard-hearted budget?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think it's probably one of the most compassionate things we can do to actually
Programs that help the elderly and
You're only
kids?
focusing on half of the equation, right? You're focusing on recipients of the money. We're trying to focus on both the recipients of the money and the folks who give us the money in the first place. And I think it's fairly compassionate to go to them and say, look, we're not going to ask you for your hard-earned money anymore. Single mom of two in Detroit, okay? Give us your money. We're not going to do that anymore unless we can...